Welcome. Good morning to our webinar for today. The topic, again, as in the previous webinar that Ricardo and I hosted, is cloud security. And in this case, it is about crystal box assessments in the cloud. So if you followed the first webinar, you will know, of course, that the cloud is a totally different kind of environment. So we thought it fit to have not just one webinar, but actually a series of three, because it's an interesting topic and we can dive a little deeper than we would be able to do in one webinar. So welcome, everyone. I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Ralph Monen. I'm the moderator for today. I'm the technical director at Secura. And with me is our own Ricardo. He's our senior security specialist, well, highly certified, and well, one of our collectors of certificates, I would say. Ricardo, thank you for being here today again. Before we actually start, I will go back to a little introduction about Secura for those of you that do not know us yet. So we are a company that specializes in digital security, and we've been doing this since the year 2000, specifically with the goal to provide insight into the security. So we like to test things, we like to also break things, and well, when it comes to breaking stuff, the cloud is actually a very welcome target. We like to do this in a holistic way, so we don't just look at the technology, we also look at people and process. And since January, we are actually part of a bigger family because French company Bureau Veritas has taken a majority stake in Secura. So we're very happy about that, and they're ready to conquer the world. We, of course, have a lot of topics that we deal with on a daily basis. We're organized loosely into public, finance, technology, and industrial market groups, and we deal with all kinds of topics and subjects from IT to IoT, and also very much OT, operational technology, so industrial control systems. Our service lines also include training and behavior, advisory and audit services, certification, assurance, obviously security testing, which is actually our biggest activity, and we have tools and some forensic services. So with that out of the way, I would actually like to hand over the mic to Ricardo, and let's start the webinar.
Thanks, Ralph.
Take it away.
So yes, this is the second of the cloud webinar series. The first one was security challenges of a cloud migration, and we talk about the different types of migration and what do you have to do as a security tester. Then we are going to talk now about the crystal box assessments, how to find common misconfigurations and how to fix them. We have some slides of the actual fixing part. And the third one is going to be container security. That was not there, but since a lot of people have been asking us about containers and what's the relationship between container and cloud and how do we test it, we're going to do that at the end of Q3, beginning of Q4. So yeah, the agenda for today is we're going to do an intro or a recap of the last webinar, 2 or 3 slides, nothing big. Then we're going to talk about the type of cloud assessments, what we do in Secure, what can you do it yourself, and finally we're going to talk about the conclusions, question and answers. So during all the presentation we will have polls, and based on that polls I will adjust the conversation and the topic. So the first poll is, which cloud providers do you use or do you intend to use? Can you put it? Can you please answer? Last time it was mostly Azure. So yeah, if give it a couple of seconds.
Yeah, we should have answers about now. Here we go.
Okay, so yeah, 60% is Azure, 40% is AWS. So really high percentage of AWS actually.
Yeah, more than last time, huh?
Much more than last time. Yeah, it's kind of expected because Azure, actually AWS is way bigger as a service, as a company, but Azure has a lot of more penetration with our clients because it's a more office-friendly environment and it's office as a service. Can you move to the next one, please? Or can you come back to the to the slides? Cool. Okay, and how much, please tell me, how much do you remember of the last webinar? Were you here the last webinar? So I know how much of the last do I have to repeat. Think, yeah, can you show us? Did you want? Okay, I see. Okay, I will talk a little bit about the last webinar, not that much, so the people that actually remember are not bored, but going to do really fast, but I will do a recap. So the first thing is that Ralph was saying at the beginning, cloud is a different way of thinking. It's everything is a little bit different. Like networking works differently, and the way that you handle your infrastructure is different. The way that you assess vulnerabilities is different. The way that you migrate, the teams are different. So for example, in a normal infrastructure, you have a team that is the networking team. And now in cloud, the guys that are or girls that are actually developing or putting stuff in the cloud, they also have to take care of the security and networking. So it's just a huge big team. So it's a really different way of thinking. There are challenges in the cloud environment. Again, as Ralph mentioned, technology, people, and processes. And there are multiple strategies of cloud migration. Each has their advantages and disadvantages. So you can just lift and shift. So we were talking about this example last time. It's like Ralph dressed as Ralph in the Netherlands go to Cancun. He will have a really good time, but he will probably melt. You have a restructuring or re-architecture of the environment, and then moving everything to the cloud. And you have like a future state that everything that is in the cloud, everything that is in infrastructure remains on-prem. And whenever you are deploying new stuff, you are working it directly into the cloud. So that led to a more hybrid environment. Cloud can be more secure, but it also provides a false sense of security. We're going to talk a lot about it today. We gave examples about disk images, encryption, networking. So in general, it's more secure, but if you do it wrong, it's way worse. Cloud gives you much more to configure, update, and maintain. That's a fact, especially if you are working on-prem and with cloud at the same time. And if the risk are addresses, this can be great for business. And we have our last cloud blog post, and we do a lot of webinars about it. So if you want to go to secura.com to see it. 62% of the problems or the threats in the cloud environment come from misconfiguration. 55% come from unauthorized access. That you can argue a little bit that it's again a misconfiguration. 52% is insecure interfaces or APIs, so essentially networking or vulnerable services running in cloud. And 49% again hijacking of accounts, service, or traffics. So in general, the 3 out of 4 that we are seeing here are misconfigurations. So if we address the cloud misconfigurations, you should be safer. So again, cloud is a different way of thinking, and this is the shared responsibility model. You will see it in all the webinars. The red part, sorry, with the mouse. The red part is the part that we are going to be talking today. That is the part that is controlled by the client, and it's the part that we can actually test, like with normal pen testing or configuration review test. And the blue part that is in the bottom is what is controlled by the cloud provider. And we also tested it in another parts of our company, but we are not going to be talking today. So if you have a smaller cloud provider, just be aware that we are not going to be discussing that, but you also have to address it. So for example, if you talk about platform as a service, that is the one that is in the middle, the data, the application, the data storage, and the runtime environment is your responsibility because it's the red part, and the blue part is the responsibility of AWS or Azure. That it's the containers, the operating system, the virtualization, the hardware. So that being said, we're going to be talking only about the red part today. And why Crystal Box? So there are three big ways of testing software. Black box testing is when you test without knowing what is behind. You don't know the code, you don't know anything. You just scan from outside, or you try to log in and see what's there. You don't know anything about the environment. Gray box testing is something that we do a lot in Secura, where you know a little bit about the application. Maybe you have a low privileged user and you're able to log in, but you don't know much more. You are not seeing the code. And the crystal box in a normal web application is where you're seeing a lot of the infrastructure. You can talk to the developer and you can say, hey, I see this, how bad it is, how good it is, how are you fixing it? When we talk about crystal box in the cloud, it's a little bit different because we are not including the code, because normally there's no code when you deploy it. Sometimes yes, but normally we don't include the code, but we actually have administrator reader access to everything, and we're actually reviewing element by element. So that's what we mean with crystal box cloud, when we have actual access to the Azure platform or whatever, or the portal, and then we're seeing everything. So if you're super technical, just as a reminder, there are ways of fixing all of these. You find a misconfiguration, so how do you fix it? One is to accept it. Sometimes the risk is so low that the business can say it's more expensive for me to fix it than just accept it, or in case we have a breach, it's not that big, so we're just going to accept the risk. We can avoid the risk, for example, by shutting down that part or not using that service. We can transfer the risk with some kind of insurance or something like that, and we can reduce the risk doing controls. And when we make the risk smaller, then we accept it. That's the normal way of dealing with this, with risk. So how do we actually find vulnerabilities and how do we address them? That's the point of the webinar. There are 5 things that we do here in Secura, or you can do in your environment, that will help us. The first one is automatic compliance scans. So we are talking here of, for example, the CIS baseline. That will give you a brief understanding of what's going on, and it's almost automatic, or in general, all the checks are automatic. You have semi-automatic or automatic operational scans that are not part of a baseline, but they talk about a little bit of operation. So for example, hey, your networking here is very lax. It's not as white and black like the compliance scan, but they need a little bit more of interpretation. Then you have non-native cloud elements running in the cloud. What we mean with that, when you have a Windows system running in an AWS environment, that is not a cloud native element, but it's running in the cloud. And if you have vulnerabilities in that operating system, you're probably introducing vulnerabilities in the whole cloud environment. Finally, what we're talking with the crystal box assessment is when we review the actual cloud elements. So we are going to go and check the S3 buckets of AWS, for example, and we go and we check the actual configuration of the S3 buckets. And there's a lot of interpretation here needed, because you can argue that an S3 bucket that is exposed to the internet is bad, but sometimes it's just hosting a website, so it's not that bad. So here it starts getting more complicated and really needs a lot of interpretation from the security team. And the last one is identity and access management review. So it's a new service that we are launching in Secura, where we actually try to pivot and privilege escalate. What is pivot? It's move. So for example, if you give us a developer role, we will try to move to another developer environment that we should not have access, or we will try to privilege escalate. That means that from a developer, we will try to become admin. So we're going to discuss about these 5 during the webinar. As I mentioned, it goes from easy to hard. Easy because it's more automatic, and it's easier to interpret because it's just yes or no with the baseline check, and super hard to do and super hard to interpret because it's less automatic. So can you please answer the next poll? Which tests have you done in your cloud environment, so I know how to keep going? So again, the first one is CIS baselines or something like that. The second one is operational. The networking, you may have a password in here, please check it. The third one is, do you run vulnerability checks in your cloud environment? The fourth one is, do you actually manually check that the configuration of your cloud elements are correct? And the fifth one is if you ever address the roles. so you don't have everybody running as contributor in your account. Can you click, please? And the results are automatic compliance scans, automatic operational scan, non-native. Okay, a little bit of everything, but mostly everyone has done SIS checks. Okay, so I will not talk that much about SIS, but yeah, sorry. Thank you. The compliance test is normally best practice cybersecurity standards that run in any cloud provider. Are often performed automatically. They're often free or semi-free, and sometimes even the cloud provider give you the results. It's a good starting point, but it's not enough. From the compliance test, I really want to tell you that it's not enough. And with this, be careful with the false positive and false negatives. Why do I say that it's not enough? We wrote a blog post in Secura 2 or 3 months ago about how a SIS AWS compliant cloud environment is not secure to most of the attacks. So for example, if you have a code injection, that is not covered for any place anywhere in the SIS AWS compliant. So if you have a web vulnerability in a web application running that have an injection and you are totally and 100% compliant of SIS, that will not save you. So it's not that related. So just be very careful that most of the real attacks that we see in a daily basis in cloud are not covered by SIS. And again, if you want to go to visit the blog, that's the book. So some examples of the SIS checks. There are levels. There are normally 1, 2, 3. The one is the less strict, but it's the one that is more friendly to users. Let's remember that the more secure you are, the more stringent is your environment and it's worse to use, let's say it like that. You have SIS checks that are scored and not scored. The scored ones are the most important, and if you fail one of the scored ones, then you are not compliant. And you have the not scored that are the good to have. And there are a lot of different ones that, as I mentioned, Alibaba, AWS, Google Workspace, 365, Azure. And this is an example from the Azure environment. For example, 3.6, ensure that the storage service encryption is set to enable. It's as simple as that. One or not, is enabled or not. And in this case, that's scored. And how to fix them. Also, the SIS baseline will give you the exact fix. Again, that doesn't mean that you can actually go and do it in your environment without a proper analysis, because everything can crash and go wrong. But the fixing is relatively straightforward. So the SIS baseline in the document will tell you exactly how to find it, exactly how to know that if it's correct or not, and exactly how to fix it. So that's the most straightforward. Let's move to the operational scans. It's similar to the baseline check, similar to the SIS, but are sometimes semi-automatic, and they definitely require some interpretation of the results. For example, networking. So you will run a scan and they will say, hey, the FTP port is open. Is that a problem or not? In general, yes. You're using an insecure service, and in general, it's a problem, but it may be needed for your environment. And if your environment is really compartmentalized, yes, then it's fine. Or infra as a code, sometimes they will point to something that is wrong in the infra, that in the code that you're using for deployment, but it's not really wrong. So it's starting to get more tricky. The combination of the SIS baselines and these automatic operational scans give you much more security. The cloud providers also do that for you. Sometimes Azure will give you recommendations that are not in the SIS baselines. And again, be careful with the false positive and false negative. So here are some examples of the things that the Azure cloud will tell you how to fix. So yeah, it's not SIS baseline and it's just the recommendations, but they let you fix it. Sometimes are one-click fixes, and be careful because it can be expensive. And this is a external scanner that we always run. So they say, for example, the security groups is open with the DNS, or potential secret in the instance user data. So you really need to interpret those results. Here's another example. So how do we fix them? Again, the first thing is determine if there are false positives, especially if you're running infra as a code checks, and is there a business reason to have that? The point of cloud is normally to start a conversation within the team. If that was a conscious decision, then okay, we probably need to accept it or transfer it or reduce it. If that was not a conscious decision, well, most likely avoid it. So let's talk about the non-cloud elements that are running in the cloud. As I mentioned, if you have a database that it's a normal database that is running in the cloud, or if you have software that is running in the cloud that you're controlling, or code that it's running in the cloud. So for example, if you have a Lambda, the code, you actually wrote the code. So if the code is vulnerable, you are vulnerable. That's the kind of things that we also check, that you have to check. This is very common with companies that migrate from their normal infrastructure to on-prem without doing their architecture, because they literally are just moving the virtual machine from on-prem to cloud. Non-cloud elements are normally the entry point to your environment. So what do I mean with that? If you get hacked in cloud, then people or a good hacker will probably be able to jump from cloud to on-prem. Examples: unpatched operating system, insecure images, software with non-vulnerabilities, insecure code. Yeah, from here, an attacker may jump. So I will give you an example. We were doing an assessment from a company that was running domain controllers in the cloud as just virtual machine. Technically is correct. You can just put anything as a virtual machine in the cloud. Yes. Practically and security-wise, that brings a lot of not vulnerability, but a lot of risk. Why? Because a lot of people were local admins in the domain controller, and we were explaining to that client that anyone that is local admin in the domain controller can extract the hashes and can get domain admin in 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So you really have to know how to interpret this, and again, cloud is not the same than on-prem. Insecure code is another example. As I mentioned, if you have a vulnerable web application, I will be able to jump from that web application to your whole premise, most likely. So how do we fix them? The same that on-prem. Updates, limit attack surface. So if you don't need to have something exposed to the internet, please don't have it. Secure code. And let me add here, be careful with your passwords. So you have to really have a good password policy. Why? Because someone in anywhere will be able to just password spray. So he will check one very common password to all your users, and then he will probably be able to go in. Almost the last one, cloud configuration review. That is what we call crystal box assessment, is that we will do a manual test in all the assets, and we will have to analyze the real impact and the vulnerabilities. Who does that? Is companies that want to make sure that the configuration is secure and the experts are interpreting the results. This is key. Sometimes we don't follow Microsoft recommendations. Sometimes we do, but because there's an interpretation, and the point of all this is trigger conversations with the company and trigger conversation within the company to know if the configuration is appropriate. I will give you an example. We were doing a test for a company that by law needed to keep all the data in the Netherlands. So Microsoft was recommending high availability. So Microsoft was recommending to move to have a copy of the database somewhere else. And we were talking to the client and we asked why you are not having that, and they explained us that legally they were not allowed. So again, this is more tricky because they need experts and interpretations. Again, the domain controller running in the cloud, this is another example here. Networking keys for configuration, the high availability is the example that I just gave, and key management. When there's no key rotation, when the keys are not saved properly, etc., etc. So how do we fix them? Having conversations. This is not white and black like the CS baselines. Sometimes one cannot be fixed. Sometimes the fix is not needed, and sometimes you really need to fix it. But here is the point of having a conversation, and having a conversation with an expert that has seen this multiple times in multiple environments, and they can tell you a little bit of how it was fixed in other places. And yeah, was that a conscious decision? Did you actually intended to do this, yes or no? Okay, if it was a conscious decision, cool. If it was not a conscious decision, can we analyze why it was done like that and if we can fix it? And finally, this is a new service that we have, but a lot of clients were asking us for that, is we determine privilege escalation and pivoting. So we normally get a low privilege role, so a developer, for example, or a normal user. And the question is, can you become admin, or can you access stuff that you are not allowed to, or can you jump from the cloud to on-prem, or can you jump from on-prem to the cloud? That's what we're trying to do here. So it's companies with a good understanding of cloud security, because if you still have very, very weak configuration or security configuration, you probably need to start with the first ones. It's really difficult to perform correctly because a really small misconfiguration can lead to a big impact, and it often involves other cloud components, so O365, GitHub, etc., etc. So some examples: credentials saved in Runbox. Some Runbox, if you don't know, allow you to control on-prem assets. There are ways to extract the credentials from the Runbox. If you do that, you can jump to on-prem really easy. And normally, these credentials stored in Runbox are administrator credentials. So you end up, being administrator. The information that is stored in environment variables or in installation scripts, manage identity impersonation. It's very common to see that they give contributor access or admin access to apps that should not have admin access. So for example, we were doing a review and we discovered that one app, one Lambda function was able to deploy administrators. So it's wrong or good, depends. In that case, it was wrong and we fixed it. With token extractions, why the token extraction is really important in the cloud? Because it can bypass conditional access and multi-factor authentication. Once I get the token of the virtual machine, for example, or the application, I can bypass everything. So it starts to become really tricky. So how do we fix them? List privileges, that's the first. Compartmentalization, it's when you really divide the assets. Conditional access, and zero trust, essentially, with Roth running. So the recap. First, SIS compliant is the first thing that you do. It's easy, automatic, white and black, easy to do. Automatic operational scans. It's a little bit more complicated that we can talk here about networking. We can talk here about infra as a code. Non-native cloud elements, when you have a web application running in the cloud exposed to the internet, is not cloud per se, but it's code running in the cloud that if you do it incorrectly, a hacker will be able to obtain access to the web application, extract the token, and then probably pivot or privilege escalate. Finally, cloud elements. So the stuff that is really cloud-based, S3 buckets, for example, or API gateways, or whatever that it's really, really cloud-based, has to be correctly configured, high availability, stuff like that. And finally, role checks. Again, the role checks is normally to answer the question, can a developer become admin? Can you jump from cloud to on-prem? Something like that. This goes from easy to hard, both in the way that you do it and the way that you interpret the results. So which one's the next step? So just here as a conclusion, again, cloud is a different way of thinking. Cloud can provide false sense of security, so you have to be careful that not by running stuff in the cloud you are more secure. In general, yes, but just be careful with that. It's possible to pivot and privilege escalate in the cloud. We've done it a lot of times. A lot of our clients that are very, 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 very secure on-prem because they have been working with us for 10, 15 years. They are not that secure in cloud, so that's our way normally in. If the risks are addressed by accepting them, avoiding them, reducing or transferring them, cloud is great for business. There are multiple levels to address cloud security, the 5 levels that we discussed. These methods are complementary, so if you're running SIS, that doesn't mean that you are safe, but if you're running role check, that doesn't mean that you don't need SIS checks. So it's a little bit of everything. Some checks, or most of the checks, should trigger conversations within your company. That's the point. have a conversation with an expert to determine the proper risk level for your company. Yes, and we will have a container security in fall 2021. And that's all. We give cloud security trainings if you need it, or you can just go to secura.com and check the stuff. So if you have questions for us, we can do it. We have like 10 minutes for questions, right? So.
Thank you, Ricardo. That's very interesting. I don't see any questions coming in yet, but I do have one for you.
The easy ones, right?
No, actually, I mean, I'm sure you've, well, I'm sure all the listeners and watchers today have followed the news about the Casilla breach and the Revil ransomware, and I've actually gotten some questions from our customers that ask if we have all our data in the cloud, are we sufficiently protected against ransomware? Are there any specific settings or things that we can do to protect us better against ransomware? And is there a big difference between cloud and on-prem in this respect?
It's a complicated question. There are ransomware groups that are starting to actually ransomware the things that are in cloud. In general, your cloud elements are more secure because you have someone that can just bypass all the authentication and authorization that it's Microsoft per se, but also that entails that they can bypass it, you know? So it's a very complicated and tricky situation. In general, you are more secure if you are using everything like high availability, if you are storing your own keys, if you really use the way of least privileges, if you use tenants, if you use security groups, if you use backups. So in general, for example, running a backup is way easier than in on-prem because it's literally 2 clicks and they say, yeah, just run a backup and put it in a cold storage that has versioning. So in practice, it's easier to be protected, but it's not automatic. Not by the fact that you are in the cloud, you are more protected per se. And there's a super cool, that's super cool idea or attack method that is floating in the internet. So with my key that was was created in my AWS account or Azure account, I get access to your account. I give you permission to use my key, and I encrypt everything with my key, and then I take the permission away from you. That's a new way of ransomware that has been like, it's a small scale still, it's still running, and it's it's small scale, but can go really bad really fast. But again, the question is, Azure in practice also can reverse that, but that means that they can't reverse that. So that's a philosophical question. It's the same of iPhone accessing your thingy for the FBI. So it's complicated. Your question is very interesting, but at the same time, it's very complicated.
So there are things that could be checked in a crystal box assessment that relate to cloud security and the impact that ransomware can have. But I'm also hearing you say that there are new types of ransomware attacks that could be perpetrated in the cloud that are specifically for the cloud, such as.
And don't wait to have ransomware. Like if you enable multi-factor authentication, conditional access, if you really limit the attack surface, if you have backups, if you have logs, if you have secure code, if you have secure operating system, then you are really limiting if you to avoid the jumping from cloud to on-prem.
Right.
So it's don't wait till you have a ransomware attack, but if you have a ransomware attack in cloud, it's normally easier to come back because it's just a couple of clicks or 3 clicks if you configure it correctly.
Right. But if you've opted for more the infrastructure as a service type of cloud deployment, then you're not having those protections built in, I guess.
I'm talking about software as a service. You are also seeing the other spectrum. If my provider gets hacked, then I lose my data. but it's not my fault, you know. So
Yeah.
it's a complicated issue, and I think that the answer is you need to be protected in all the 4 or 5 things that we were discussing.
Yeah.
And that will really limit the risk. When I'm talking with my friends, like personal friends, I always say the point is not to be the easiest to hack. A hacker, normally they just want easy money, fast money. They will run automatic scans in the internet. They will, like, unless they are really, really, really targeting you, if you are moderately secure, you should be fine.
Yeah, it's like when 2 people are being chased by a bear.
Exactly.
Just make sure you're not the slowest guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's essentially that. Yeah.
Okay. So one question about the crystal box assessments is, what type of access do you need to do such an assessment? Can you do it remotely, or do you need to run tools? How is this done?
We normally get read admin privileges, so we should be able to read everything of the part of the cloud environment that you want us to check. So if you want us to check just a resource group, you only give us access to that resource group. Normally, if, for example, Azure, because most of the people use Azure, we need 2 independent access. We need the part of the Active Directory. So if you want us to check users and tokens, multi-factor authentication and all that, and we need the actual part of the cloud elements, let's say it like that. Sometimes they even give us access to the GitHub configuration, Office 365, because as we were mentioning, it's really easy to pivot from there. So I will give you an example. We were doing an operating system check, and we discovered that some passwords were stored insecurely of one key account that I will not going to tell you which key account. So we say, okay, and we talk to the client, hey, we're seeing this password, how bad it is? Well, it's not that bad because, okay. And we went to Office 365 and we actually checked that username with that password, and we got access without multi-factor authentication to a key account of the company. So it's the kind of things that it's like you really have to switch your mindset to you're working in cloud now, you're not on-prem. The way that you defend yourself of passwords in on-prem, or password reusal in on-prem is really different than the way that you defend yourself in cloud, and that's why you need an expert to actually check what can go wrong, because it's a different mindset. It's a different mindset.
Right. So I think we have time for one more question. Are there any questions from the audience currently?
What?
I'm not seeing it in my display though.
Can you just say it? In the chat.
I'm not seeing it. Oh, wait, here it is in the chat. Aha. Let's see. Okay, here we go. In a regular cloud assessment, do you look at the Azure Active Directory and also perform attacks to pivot to on-prem environments? If so, what scenarios have you seen or used?
Okay, that's a really complicated question. Legally, I can only check what is in scope, like legally. If you really want us to check that, just put it in the scope, put it in the contract, and we can do it.
So we can try it.
Yeah. We can do it. If it's not in scope and I'm really just seeing that the administrator has not multi-factor authentication and it's really bad, I will probably just put it in the report. But I cannot actually perform any test that it's not in scope. So sometimes when we are speaking with the developers, they're very cautious on the things that they're telling us. It's like, okay, cool that you're cautious and you don't want any findings, but even if you say this is the password of the database and the database is out of scope, I cannot go and access the database. So
let's assume that the scenario is to pivot from cloud to on-prem. What kind of techniques have you seen scenarios?
There are a lot. So for example, the most common way of doing it is called hash synchronization in Azure.
Password write back?
Yes,
basically.
Exactly. So what happens is there's a hash of the hash stored in the cloud, but the authorization, it's done by they create, when you do that, you create a new, like a server and a new user on-prem, and you create a user in the cloud. If any of those two users, the user in the cloud can reset all the passwords of the on-prem users, including the domain admins. and the users here can authorize the access of these guys in here. So if you compromise this machine that it's normally not a domain controller, so it's not that protected, this user that it's running an on-prem, you can jump to the cloud. If you compromise this cloud user, you can bypass all the password restrictions here. There's other ways of doing that. For example, if you are using pass-through authentication, you will have an agent, and there are common ways of disturbing the agent. So you will, it works like the agent asks the cloud, hey, do you have anyone for me to approve? And the cloud say no. Okay, so the agent goes back. So what does an attacker do? What can we do? We create a new agent, and we talk to the cloud before the normal agent, and we can either authorize everything coming, or we can tell them log the password that it's passing as a password pass-through authentication, and you start creating a log using the fake agent of all the passwords. And another method that is very common, it's called federation, that it's you trust me, I trust you. So that's an easy way of jumping. So yeah, it's a very common scenario. The way we run it normally is we see environment passwords, we see we can jump from Office to Azure, we can jump from on-prem to Azure. So it's a really cool thing.
Okay, yeah, so it has a lot to do with the roles and the segregation of roles and the, you know, the abundance maybe of administrator functions and roles in Azure Active Directory that enable you then to change or modify the on-prem AD if that's linked or if there is a trust there.
It's a normal, it's correct. Technically, it's correct to do password hash synchronization if you're aware that your hashes, the hashes of the hashes are going to be stored in the cloud. So if you make that conscious decision, then it's perfectly fine. But then you need to protect those users and that server that is on-prem. But it has to be a, you know, like that server needs to have one admin.
Yeah.
Not everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you give, that's the issue.
Okay, and are there also like network-based scenarios here? If you, for instance, have VPNs running between your on-prem and your cloud environment, I guess you could just tunnel through that and hop from one to the other on a network basis, right?
Exactly. So in general, your cloud is it's segregated in general unless you open it.
Yeah, exactly.
But there are some elements that are always open unless closed. So for example, key vaults. And you will ask why
key vault?
Yeah, the key vault, the Azure key vault is open by default in a network level. And you will ask why, how? And then you can check, okay, the certificates running in the cloud, cool. But there's no real logic of that. Or S3 buckets 5 or 10 years ago, it was super easy to open it to the world, and all the AWS hacks were misconfigured S3 buckets. So it's networking can get tricky. It's not secure by default, and then again you need someone to actually check the networking to see if it's good or not.
Yeah.
But we've seen clients that run all their security using network security groups. So it's super interesting.
Which is like an access list, right?
Yeah, if it's done correctly, it's just a host firewall in cloud.
Yeah.
So if you do it correctly, it can be super secure, but you have to do it correctly.
Right. All right. I think that is a very interesting topic, and we have no more questions. So last comment here, I would request the listeners to actually go to our survey and fill it out. It will appear automatically after the webinar ends. So if you have any other questions, I would say, contact us. And for now, thank you very much, Ricardo, and see you at the next webinar on container security in the cloud.